Imagine waking up one Friday morning, the sky above you burning a deep, angry red, the air thick with smoke so dense it scratches at your throat. It's January 13th, 1939, Victoria, Australia, and no one has any bloody idea what's about to hit. They called it Black Friday, but at the time, nobody could have imagined the scale of terror about to be unleashed. Towns that yesterday were sleepy, quiet communities would by nightfall be reduced to smoldering ash. The forests, the farmland, even the air itself seemed alive, ready to devour everything in its path. It had been a scorcher of a summer, sun blaring down for weeks, rivers drying to cracked mud, the heat bending the horizon. Farmers and locals were used to bushfires, sure, but this was different. There was a restless whisper in the treetops, a hush in the animals that hinted something bigger, something brutal. And yet, life carried on. Children played in dusty paddocks, sheep grazed lazily, women hung washing on the lines, unaware that the wind was already plotting a massacre. By late morning, small fires started to smolder in the forests north and east of Melbourne. At first just little blazes, barely a nuisance. But the weather gods weren't having mercy. Gusts of wind whipped the flames into a frenzy, turning them into firestorms that could leap across roads, swallow farmhouses, and leave scorched footprints kilometers wide. Could anyone escape when the sky itself seemed to rain fire? And then, as afternoon rolled into evening, Victoria itself became unrecognizable. The roar of 1,000 flames snapping trees, cracking timber, animals screaming. It wasn't just a fire. It was a living, breathing beast, hunting every soul in its path. People bolted from their homes, horses panicked, towns vanished in minutes. Smoke turned day into night. Heat waves shimmered over the plains like molten waves. What would you do if that inferno was barreling toward you, and you had mere moments to act? If you were standing on your veranda, watching the horizon glow like the gates of hell, could you keep your wits about you? Or would panic take hold, just like it did for thousands of Victorians that day? The tragedy of Black Friday 1939 wasn't just the fire, it was the scale, the speed, the sheer unrelenting fury. And yet amid the terror, stories of courage, desperation, and heartbreak were just beginning to unfold. Stick around, because the night Victoria burned would change this land forever, and the tales of survival are both haunting and inspiring. The morning of January 13th, 1939 had already baked the land to a brittle, tinder-dry state. For weeks, Victoria had been scorched under relentless sun, the soil cracking and the gum trees groaning in the heat. Farmers like John O'McAllister were already on edge, the smell of smoke from distant blazes pricking at their senses. "Sheila," he called to his wife, wiping sweat off his brow. "I reckon that wind's gonna carry something nasty today. Best we keep the hayshed cleared." Sheila nodded, tension knitting her face, but even she couldn't fathom the horror barreling towards them. Across the state, early fires had started quietly, tiny flames in scrub and forest, easily ignored if you weren't paying attention. But the day was no ordinary summer scorcher. The air pressure had dropped, the winds were building, and the infamous phone effect had begun. Gusts whipped across the ridges, shaking the branches like they were alive. Mick O'Reilly, tending his sheep near King Lake, recalled, "I'd never seen the sky turn that color, mate. Blood red, like the world itself was on fire. Birds were dropping from the sky, and even the cattle wouldn't move. Why, midday, the fires had begun to merge. A small blaze at Bunyip Forest had grown into a wall of flames, roaring across the landscape at terrifying speed. Daza Thompson, a young farmhand near Marysville, remembered sprinting across paddocks with nothing but a blanket over his shoulders. "I thought I'd die running through that heat," he said later. "The wind was pushing it so fast, you could feel the air burn your lungs before the flames even touched you." He'd grabbed his younger sister, clutching her hand, dragging her through the chaos. "How would you have reacted, watching the horizon glow like molten metal?" Telegraphs and newspapers were trying to warn communities, but the scale was unprecedented. Some towns had volunteer brigades, but they were spread thin, battling multiple fires at once, often with nothing but shovels and buckets. The fire was fast, smart even. It jumped fire breaks, torched timber fences, and swallowed houses whole. Sheila McAllister had watched from the kitchen window as the smoke thickened, her heart pounding. "Jono," she whispered, gripping the edge of the bench. "It's coming faster than any fire I've seen. Should we pack the kids?" And just like that, the reality hit. They were no longer farming. They were fleeing for survival. The wind made the fire nearly impossible to predict. In towns like Kinglake and Narbathong, locals were first caught off guard, then trapped. Survivors recall the eerie calm just before the flames struck, a hush that descended over the land as if nature itself was holding its breath. Then came the roar, a deep, guttural, unholy sound. Animals panicked, roofs ignited, and smoke filled the sky like a suffocating blanket. Imagine hearing that roar approaching your house. How would you react? By late afternoon, the firestorm had become a monster. Eyewitnesses like old Mick Harrington described the air shimmering with heat, the smell of charred wood and fur making it almost impossible to breathe. It was like standing inside a furnace, mate. I could feel the timber on the homestead snapping around me, sparks dancing past my face. Every step could have been my last. Children were screaming, parents were shouting names, and families were forced to abandon everything they owned. Even the best prepared locals were humbled. Fire breaks meant nothing, rivers were too low to help, and the wind kept changing, turning a safe paddock into a death trap in minutes. People formed impromptu lines, carrying buckets of water, smothering embers, trying to save each other, each movement a gamble with fate. Put yourself in their shoes. Could you have survived? Would you have had the courage to risk it for a neighbor or a stranger? By dusk, the fire had claimed hundreds of square kilometers, consuming forests, farmland, and homes. Smoke darkened the skies over Melbourne, drifting hundreds of kilometers away. Families huddled together in paddocks and creek beds, listening to the hellish symphony of cracking timber, roaring flames, and screaming animals. It wasn't just fire. They were fighting for their very lives, against a force bigger than anything they'd ever faced. And this was only the beginning. By the afternoon, Victoria had become a furnace, a land of fire and smoke where the sky itself seemed to fall. Small blazes that morning had merged into a roaring, unstoppable wall of heat and flame. The wind was relentless, gusting up to 100 kilometers an hour, pushing the fire through forests, paddocks, and townships like a predator on the hunt. Jono McAllister was already on the run, dragging his family behind him through fields of parched grass. "Sheila, keep the kids low. Don't look back," he yelled over the roar. Smoke stung their eyes, ash coated their hair, and the heat was so intense it felt like their skin might melt off. Across the state, entire communities were facing the same nightmare. Mick O'Reilly had taken refuge with other farmers near Kinglake. We huddled in a creek bed, he recalled later. Water up to our waists, smoke choking us, flames snapping and cracking around the banks. You could hear trees crashing down like thunder all around. I honestly thought I was seeing the end of the world. Some tried to fight the fire with whatever they could grab, shovels, wet blankets, buckets, but it was futile. The firestorm was clever, unpredictable, and bloodthirsty. In Marysville, Daza Thompson remembered clutching his little sister as their house ignited. I could see the roof glow first, then the walls went up like kindling. We ran out the back and dived into the river, shaking and coughing. I thought we were dead more times than I can count. Every second it felt like the flames were gaining on us. Families were split apart in the panic, neighbors lost to the inferno, and screams echoed across the valleys, swallowed only by the ferocity of the fire. Acts of heroism were almost unthinkable. Sheila McAllister, separated from Jono, for a moment, helped a neighbor drag their elderly father through smoke and embers. "Come on, old mate, you're not staying here," she shouted, slapping his back, urging him forward. Smoke made voices hoarse, eyes useless, but still people kept going, driven by sheer will. Others weren't so lucky. Entire homesteads vanished in minutes, leaving nothing but ash, twisted metal, and the haunting smell of burnt lives. The scale of destruction was unimaginable. By evening, Victoria had been carved into a patchwork of blackened forest and scorched earth. Trees had snapped like matchsticks, animals lay dead in fields, and the few towns still standing were shrouded in smoke and chaos. Mick Harrington described wandering through a ruined township, the ground still smoldering beneath his boots. I stepped over what used to be houses. One minute a family was here, the next, bugger all. It was like the fire erased people. Put yourself in their shoes. How would you even begin to process seeing everything you know gone in the blink of an eye? And yet, amid the horror, people continued to save lives. Jono managed to regroup with Sheila and the kids, dragging them to a hollow in a paddock where they huddled together as the firestorm passed over. Others formed human chains to carry the injured out of danger. It was sheer desperation, grit, and courage, every second a fight against nature's wrath. By nightfall, the fire had reached its peak. The roar was deafening, a constant malevolent presence. Sparks flew like missiles, and embers ignited fresh fires far ahead of the main blaze. Smoke turned the sky black, blotting out the sun, making nightfall feel like eternal twilight. Some survivors couldn't sleep. They stayed awake, listening to the hiss of dying embers, wondering if the inferno would return. Imagine the fear, mate. The air so hot it burns your lungs, the ground vibrating. With fallen trees, the sky an angry orange glow. What would you have done if you were in their shoes? Could you have found a creek, a hollow, a safe patch of ground in time? Could you have saved anyone else while keeping your own family alive? The night was only the first. By dawn, the aftermath would begin to reveal the staggering scale of what Victoria had endured. But for those trapped in the fire, the horror was still very much alive, and survival was just beginning. Dawn broke over a land that looked like it had been scraped from the face of the earth. Victoria wasn't the same state that had woken up yesterday. No birdsong, no breeze through the gums, only the bitter, acrid stench of charred wood and animal carcasses. Families emerged from whatever shelter they could find, blackened, coughing, hearts still racing, staring at the horror that lay before them. Jono McAllister and Sheila stumbled out of their paddock hollow, the kids clinging to them, eyes wide, hair singed. "Struth, is this real?" Jono whispered, shaking his head, the smoke still curling around his boots. Whole worlds turned upside down, Burr. Owns like King Lake and Marysville were unrecognizable. Streets were lined with rubble, fences twisted like paper, and chimneys still smoldering. Survivors wandered in shock, calling names, hoping desperately to hear familiar voices. Mick O'Reilly had lost sight of half his neighbors. I found old Mrs. Thompson by the creek, shaking like a leaf. Couldn't speak a word, just staring at the ground where her house had been. Everywhere you looked, someone was crying, someone was searching, someone was pulling a body from the ash. Could you even imagine seeing your neighbor's house gone, their pets gone, your entire street wiped out in hours? Firefighters, volunteers, and locals who survived were already forming chains, trying to douse embers before sparked another hellish blaze. Water was scarce, and the heat lingered like a curse. Daza Thompson recounted, "We were soaking blankets in the creek, throwing them over hot patches, carrying buckets of water. It was relentless, mate. The fire wasn't done with us yet. Even when you thought it was safe, it'd flare up again. Some climbed into tanks of water, some jumped into rivers, some huddled in hollow logs. The ingenuity was desperate, but necessary. Communities pulled together in ways that would later be remembered as heroic." Sheila McAllister helped drag a neighbor's father, injured and barely conscious, to the creek. "Come on, old mate," she said, tears streaming. "We're not leaving you here." Others formed impromptu triage points, using blankets to shield those suffering from burns, smoke inhalation, and shock. And still there were stories of unimaginable bravery. Kids running through embers to save pets, farmers holding off flames to let neighbors escape, strangers shielding one another from the inferno. Put yourself in their shoes. Would you have been able to think clearly, act decisively, or would panic have taken over? Mid all this chaos, stories of sheer heartbreak were everywhere. Mick Harrington found the remains of his family's farm. The homestead was nothing but ash and blackened beams. I sat there, staring, feeling like I'd been gutted. He said, every memory gone. Every Christmas, every Sunday dinner, gone in a blink. The emotional toll was staggering, on top of the physical danger. And yet, the human spirit kept going. Communities formed makeshift shelters in churches, schools, and barns, sharing water, food, and whatever comfort they could. Why, midday, the initial fires were dying down, but Victoria was left in smoldering silence. Smoke still choked the air, and the heat radiated off the ground like a lingering ghost. Rescuers began tall. Ying the missing and injured. Reports were fragmentary, incomplete, but the scope was horrifying. Over 70 people dead, hundreds injured, and tens of thousands of acres reduced to ash. Survivors were dazed, grateful to be alive, but haunted by what they had witnessed. And right in the middle of that chaos, stories emerged that demanded to be shared. Families recounted how they had clung together, how neighbors had risked everything to save others, how children had acted with courage beyond their years. We reckon some of you watching today have relatives or family stories of bushfires, near misses, or even tragedies like this. If you've got a story about surviving a fire, a flood, or any disaster, share it in the comments below. It's important to remember, to honor those moments, and to see how resilient humans can truly be. By the end of that day, the survivors were exhausted but alive, faces smeared with soot and tears, hearts heavy with loss. Yet even in despair, there was a sense that they would rebuild. The fire had taken so much, but the determination to survive, to care for each other, to cling to life, was unbroken. And this wasn't just a story of destruction. It was a story of courage, resilience, and the raw power of human spirit. The days following Black Friday 1939 were relentless. Victoria's scorched land stretched further than most could comprehend, and the fires, though slowing, weren't done yet. Gusts of wind fanned lingering embers into new flames, and smoke hung thick like a shroud over towns and paddocks. Survivors who thought they'd escaped danger found themselves trapped in a second wave of panic and fear. John McAllister and his family had just returned to their paddock to check what remained, only to find sparks drifting on the wind, igniting fence lines in seconds. "Struth, mate, it's still alive," Jono yelled, throwing sand over the flames, sweat and ash coating his face. Meanwhile, Mick O'Reilly had been helping at a makeshift shelter for displaced families near Kinglake. The hall was packed with people coughing, crying, and holding on to whatever scraps of normality remained. Mick remembered looking out at the blackened horizon, smoke curling up in ghostly fingers. It felt like the world had ended, yet people were still smiling at each other, sharing water, blankets, even stories of lost pets. You could see the spirit of the bush in their eyes, he said. Could you have kept your courage in that moment, helping strangers while your own world was gone? Rescue efforts intensified. Volunteers trekked through scorched forests, pulling people from creek beds, hollow logs, and even half-burned homes. Daza Thompson had helped carry an elderly woman, blind in one eye, across a field still smoldering underfoot. She kept mumbling, "Bless you, young fella, bless you." Every step I thought my boots would melt into the mud, he recalled. Firefighters worked with relentless determination, forming human chains, throwing water over embers, digging fire breaks with bare hands. The heat was unyielding, the wind unpredictable, and yet no one gave up. Families searched desperately for each other. Sheila McAllister finally reunited with Jono after being separated in the chaos, clutching their children and trembling. "I thought we'd lost him. Thought the fire had swallowed the whole lot of us," she whispered, Across the state, similar reunions were happening, each one a small miracle amid the devastation. But heartbreak was everywhere too. Houses gone, farms reduced to ash, livestock dead, and over 70 souls already claimed by the inferno bar. Fire didn't discriminate. It tore through forests and farmland alike, sparing bugger all. Entire landscapes were unrecognizable. Survivors spoke of the eerie silence. CE after the worst had passed, punctuated by distant cries of animals and the groan of dying trees. Jono remembered walking through a blackened paddock, stepping over smoldering fence posts, his children holding tightly to his hands. The smell, like burnt wool, timber, and something else I can't describe. I'll never forget it, mate. Never. Imagine putting yourself in their shoes, seeing everything you knew obliterated, yet knowing the fire might flare again at any moment. Amid the chaos, stories of courage continued to emerge. Mick Harrington had found a neighbor trapped under a fallen tree, scorched but alive, and together they dragged him to safety. Dazza Thompson guided a group of children through smoke-choked gullies, keeping them calm with jokes and reassurances even as sparks fell around them. It was grit and ingenuity, mate, human spirit rising against the most brutal odds. By the evening of the second day, most fires had burned themselves out, leaving Victoria a charred, smoldering wasteland. The full horror was beginning to sink in, homes lost, livelihoods destroyed, and a landscape forever changed. Survivors huddled together, exhausted, bruised, and shell-shocked, but alive. And in their conversations, you could hear the questions that would linger for decades. How did this happen? Could it have been prevented? And, most hauntingly, what would we have done differently if we'd had even a few more minutes' warning? The fire had tested every ounce of courage, resilience, and humanity. Communities had been torn apart, yet they were already finding ways to cling to life, support each other, and begin the slow process of recovery. The flames were gone, but the scars, on the land, on hearts, and on memory, would remain forever. The morning after Black Friday 1939 was eerily quiet. Victoria's landscape had been stripped bare, charred trees stood like blackened. Skeletons, paddocks were reduced to ash, and the scent of smoke lingered in every nostril. Families emerged from their temporary shelters, blinking in the pale, dusty light, trying to comprehend what had happened. Homes were gone, livestock dead, and towns that had thrived just days ago were little more than smoldering ruins. John O'Macallister knelt in the remnants of his homestead, picking through scorched timbers. Every memory gone, mate. All life we'd built. It's just nothing, he whispered, voice hoarse with grief. Brr. His death toll was staggering. Over 70 Victorians had perished in the flames, countless more injured, and thousands left homeless. Entire communities had been shattered. Mick O'Reilly wandered through a burnt-out paddock near King Lake, helping survivors recover what little remained. We lost friends, neighbors. Some families lost everything, he said. I reckon some of us would never really get over it. And yet, amid that sorrow, stories of courage continued to shine, a reminder of the human spirit, even in the face of utter devastation. E-building began almost immediately, though progress was slow and heart-wrenching. Families salvaged what they could, often nothing more than a few personal belongings or a patch of soil. Churches, schools, and community halls became makeshift shelters, and towns pooled resources to help each other survive. Sheila McAllister worked tirelessly, tending to the injured and comforting those who had lost everything. It was heartbreaking, mate, but there wasn't a choice, she said. We had to get on with it for the kids, for everyone. Environmental impact was profound. Thousands of hectares of forest had been obliterated. Wildlife that survived fled, many perishing later from starvation or exposure. Rivers and soil were affected, and some areas would take decades to return to their former vitality. Calm. Unities began to realize that the landscape itself had changed. forever altered by the fire's fury. Socially, the fire left a deep mark on Victorian society. People became more aware of bushfire risks, volunteer firefighting brigades were strengthened, and safety measures were slowly implemented. Survivors spoke often of the lessons learned: never underestimate the fire, respect the land, and prepare for the worst. John O. McAllister would later say, "We thought we knew the bush, but the bush had a lesson for us, and we paid for it." For time, memorials were erected to honor those lost. The stories of heroism, the farmers pulling neighbors from flames, the children guided to safety, the families who refused to leave one another behind, were passed down through generations. Mick Harrington often spoke at community gatherings. We remember not just the fire, but the courage of people, the way communities came together. That's what keeps the memory alive. Black Friday, December 24th, 1939 was more than a bushfire. It was a defining moment in Victoria's history. It showed the brutality of nature, the fragility of human life, and the resilience of the human spirit. Families were forever changed, landscapes scarred, and communities reshaped. And yet, the spirit of survival endured. Lessons learned, stories told, and courage remembered. Ow, I want you to think about this, mate. How would you have reacted if you'd been there? How old would you have been? Could you have saved a neighbor, a friend, a family member? Or would the fire have claimed everything in a heartbeat? If you've got memories, stories passed down from your family, or thoughts about surviving disasters, share them in the comments below. Let's remember, reflect, and honor those who faced hell and lived to tell the tale. Victoria was scarred, yes, but she endured, and so did the people, carrying their lessons, their memories, and their courage into the future, forever changed but never broken.